In this episode of the podcast, I talked to my friend Sean O'Malley, who was recently a co-founder and the chief technology officer of healthcare data startup Monocle Insights. Sean and I talk about the healthcare industry circumstances that led him to launch Monocle, the company's approach to delivering data-based insights to its clients, a shortcoming in Monocle's clients' analytical capabilities due to budget constraints and the changing labor demographics of the United States, as well as Sean's recent transition into cybersecurity. If any of that sounds interesting to you, you're welcome to join us.
Maybe I can talk about where I came from slightly to contextualize where I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
So I've really spent the entirety of my career applying complex decision science, behavioral economics, and machine learning to really massive data sets to inform strategic decision-making, decision science, right? So first in advertising, where I leverage a series of algorithms around causal modeling and autonomous bidding and Nash equilibrium theory to nudge people to, or not to nudge people, but to qualify the value of any individual person who gets served an ad based on what we have and their kind of anticipated interest in a product. I found advertising to be not that interesting to me, and I needed my head and my heart to make sense. And so
You needed your head what?
My head and my heart to align a little bit better, right?
Yes.
So, at that point, made the next rational decision, which was move to rural Peru for nearly a year, where I,
of course,
helped run medical missions of all kinds, running those data systems, and just generally volunteering, doing some work in development economics as well. I wasn't sure if I wanted a FUD in that area.
What's a FUD?
PhD. And
that was in what field that you considered?
I considered development economics.
Oh, okay.
And, that specific interest was, I realized that I needed to be in the applied space because I'm kind of just a blue collar worker underneath of all of it. And so I ended up then being the first data science hire at a large health system in Colorado, touched epidemiology, supply chain, provider behavior, social network theory, hospital-borne diseases, managing folks as well as reporting directly to kind of C-suite executives. But I got
kinds of things.
Yeah, I was busy. It was too busy to be effective.
So you're the first data science hire, but it's a large system. And so it sounds like everybody doing anything is like, oh, I've got a data guy.
Yeah. So I was simultaneously setting the quote unquote AI strategy of the hospital system while also explaining bar charts to executives. So,
Broad scope. When was that?
That was 2018 to 2021.
Okay.
Was my time there. And after which, something that so much of our analysis fundamentally centered on electronic medical records. And what we found was that EMRs had inherent sample size bias that made us produce really crappy results often, right?
What do you mean by sample size bias?
So, right, take the Denver Metro, for example. Super great, a really solid payer mix. Therefore, there's a lot of health system competition in the area. Every one of these health systems sits on their own operational electronic medical record, and they are 0% incentivized to share information with one another. Hospital, patient be damned, right?
Despite the fact that patients might move from one to the other.
And despite the fact that not sharing that information could kill someone.
Because you could identify patterns if you could see them all that would help?
Yes. And effectively, the entire US healthcare system has come to realize, or the doctors themselves are not incentivized to make the best decisions, but further, they, as a matter of practice, have to have Bayesian thinking. And they have
to. What do you mean by that?
They rely very little on the historical context other than the primary highlights of an individual's story and what they can ascertain in that individual appointment.
Okay. And so they have some data points from history, they have some data points from the appointment, and they're making decisions more statistically than like qualitatively, reasonably?
I would say almost they use the term Bayesian, I think, more loosely than I would like, but it's the idea of I come in with a prior assumption of disease states and or sort of what this patient has going on based on some really high level things. And then I try to actually decide most of, left, right, up or down inside of this appointment, because I have come to realize that I cannot rely on data because the data is usually insufficient for me to make decisions on as a provider.
Okay. So you're saying because the data, specifically the data contained in these electronic medical records, is faulty, doctors have learned not to make data database decisions?
I would say
Or am I
in some ways they're
misunderstanding that?
faulty. Yeah, I would say in some ways faulty, in many ways incomplete,
Okay.
mostly incomplete, right?
Okay. Anyways,
Yeah. So not to get too dumb, and I have all sorts of qualms about the U.S. healthcare system to date, but
so you're working in this health system, you begin
Mhm.
to encounter this problem.
And I convinced my boss to start a company with me. So what we did was we built relationships with. We looked at this. We said, okay, well, they don't have an incentive to share information, to put that information in motion. Where is there an incentive for information to be in motion? And that is in getting paid. Folks love getting paid. And how do you get paid? You submit your healthcare claims to claims clearinghouses, which process them for your payers. Those claim clearinghouses really serve as kind of the switching stations, or kind of all of the US healthcare financial
Hmm.
activity between health systems and the insurance companies themselves.
Interesting. And what are they called again?
Clearinghouses.
Clearinghouses. Huh.
Yeah, there's been a hell of a lot of consolidation in that area, to where, the top 8 clearinghouses in the United States, cover what is 80 some percent of all claims processed in the United States.
Hmm.
You snag a couple straggling systems like Providence that do it themselves, and you can get to what is effectively comprehensive coverage of every insurance claim in the United States. And what we did then, right, is to be able to combine those data and sell those, you're required to tokenize the patient identifiers.
Okay. So that it's anonymous.
So that it's anonymous. So Sean O'Malley becomes XYZ123, but you get to see, that I went to primary care doctor. I had, came in with these diagnoses, had these procedures. I was referred by this, then that primary care doctor referred me to a specialist.
So the
That
person has an
specialist
identifier
performed.
that allows you to recognize patterns, but you can't tell who they actually are.
Yeah, I can. And what that does from a health system perspective is it gives you the ability to really see where your patients came from and where they went, not as a matter of like, I can see Sean came from UC Health and ended up at, Intermountain, and then ended up at, Adventist, but to say generally, we see patients go into Bob, the doctor, right? And Bob, the doctor, sends them to wherever. And so the patients become sort of the currency of understanding provider practice patterns,
Or the
as
medium.
well as, the medium would be the right. Well, unfortunately, in healthcare, that's how they look at them, as a means to a dollar, which is why I'm no longer in healthcare. But these patients allow us to understand provider practice patterns, because we can see the doctors. Doctors aren't de-identified. The procedures performed, the diagnoses seen, the costs around it, those estimates, between all of that, you get a really good idea of what are the patterns of care, what works, what doesn't, what's wasteful, what's not. And we, built a business around selling those insights back to the health systems themselves.
And how did you convince the clearinghouses to share this data with you?
They like money. We paid them a lot of money
Hmm.
to be able to extract those data assets, tokenize them, and sell them out. Right? It's an alternative
So they're a
stream
supplier.
of income. So they're effectively a data supplier. And we weren't the first and won't be the last to kind of follow that pattern, but we were the first to try to push it into the provider space around meaningful strategic decision science. Those clearinghouse relationships and much of those mechanisms are really the lifeblood of the pharmaceutical industry, right? So if a pharmaceutical said, hey, I came up with this new drug, it services patients who have this diagnosis. Well, I'm going to tap the clearinghouses to be able to see which doctors in the United States see patients that would be fantastic contestants, so that I can then execute a clinical trial. I can understand then their patterns before and after their visits, to be able to track results, to be able to submit every one of the steps. And those clearinghouses have made a lot of money off of that process, because pharmaceuticals make so much dang money that it's, there are stories of rare disease drugs, them being willing to pay $1.5 million for a list of 40 doctors' names and addresses who have ever seen that specific type of thing, right?
Because it's worth it.
Yeah, you think about, complexity, all these different things. It's like, no, like it's a CSV that could, fit on your cell phone, and they're like, signing a $1.5 million check for it.
So the clearinghouses are familiar with these kinds of transactions, but you, and the company's name is Monocle. You and your boss started Monocle. You bought data data from the clearinghouses, and you're using it in a unique way to derive insights about providers and the way that patients interact with providers, where providers send them.
And I'd say specifically referral patterns is where most of the blind spots exist that cost health system money and outcomes. And so a lot of times doctors inside of a system will refer out to this outside of the system, but they'll never be communicated back from that competing, health system or EMR, whatever, that person has officially, went from your doctor internally, externally, and then they're just blind to it. They only see completed referrals inside of their own system.
Okay.
And so that's what we helped them kind of, hey, this is the social network of all your doctors.
You illuminated the blind spot.
Yep.
Okay. So then what?
We gained some solid traction, hit about $1 million in ARR, and had, probably a couple million in pipeline. And what we found is that US healthcare their margins have halved every single year since 2020.
Wow.
on median. And a lot of the folks that were gung-ho in the very long average 18-month sales cycle, a lot of these folks that were gung-ho had such budgetary constraints that they would many of them laid off their analytics team. Others outsourced them to India, while others still basically just had any and all innovation budgets just completely slashed to nothing. And so something that would have been, $350,000 per year deal for just data became, hey, can you do a bunch of services plus your expensive data for like 150? And
you're having to do these services because we're laying off our analytics team because we don't have the cash.
So it motivated for us what was a super deep dive into demographic shifts in the United States, because we just saw, it sounds odd, but what we saw was we have a product that people want. They know it needs to solve a problem that they know they have, and actual execution of that solution is out of the grasp unless Monocle themselves wants to just really build out a services practice.
Because they don't have the talent to take advantage of what you're offering.
They don't have the talent, they don't have the budget. And what we ended up finding was that, demographically, the United States is already halfway through really a major collapse in their skilled workforce. So the working age population being 25 to 65, that population, and this is a Bureau, National Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can look it up and reference it, and I have a blog post about it. But the working age population in 2030 will be 18% of what it was in the year 2000, which is that 25 to 60.
18%?
Yes, 18%.
So there is a 82% decline from 2020 to 2030 in
working age population.
That's extreme. How is that possible?
Birth control,
and has this been due for some time? And now,
we've all seen it coming, but everybody works. I mean, we're already halfway through the wave, right?
Because that started birth control. When was that? 60s, 70s?
60s, right? But you've had two generations. If you multiply 1/2 by 1/2, becomes 1/4, right? So there's a waterfall effect really to the population decline. And it's actually, millennials are closer to replacement rate, but millennials' parents were well under replacement rate. That's really who, the population is, the working age population is really leaning heavily on that. And as boomers now go over 65, they're out, right? So you think about this from a technical perspective, right? From a technical aptitude perspective, anybody over the age of 50, are we back?
I heard anybody over the age of 50.
Yeah. Anybody over the age of 50, upskilling is something that they're not terribly interested in. And you can't grow technical skills on a tree, or if it is a tree, it's an oak tree, right?
Slow.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't grow like a weed, let's say. And so when you have a large decline in the overall population, then that means that your skilled workforce, which has the least amount of replaceability, is under the most amount of pressure. So we see this in US healthcare. They call it the labor demic, right? Doctors and nurses, there's just not enough of them. And then you see that in the technical workforce. There's multiple reports out there that say, almost anyone who wants to reach technical goals in the next few years, the AI bubble all considered, is the major impediment is just a lack of humans that know how to do technical things, full stop. Every single person is, it's not, do you have a gap in technical skill workforce? But how big is your gap? And most of them anticipate that gap getting larger. I know that this is a tangent that has very little to do, but it also has everything to do with the decisions we made around Monocle. Because industries like healthcare will have, not just a 1, 2, 3 punch and then a haymaker with this. I mean, I don't know if it's going to have to be socialized or what the deal is, but, I don't think it made sense for Monocle to stick around. You can get an A in the class and find out you took the wrong major. And we took a step back and said, hey, this is the wrong major.
Man, that is fascinating.
It's my life just happens to you, and you try to do the best to analyze it and take the next best step forward. But a lot of that, take that same analysis to its next logical step, right? You have a large US population with proliferating tools, proliferating number of endpoints and outputs and all these different things, quote unquote AI tools, while you're simultaneously having a demographic collapse. If I wanted to pick one job that would have a hell of a couple decades, it would be a hacker. You have information systems proliferating with a population to manage them. Yeah, not that I'm going to be a hacker, but right. So think about that question, right? You have information systems proliferating. Wow. You have the demographics to manage it collapsing. This will be the age of the hacker.
That's an amazing insight. So there's this aging population that's going to be leaning more on the healthcare system as they age. And that's not maybe the major factor in what you're talking about, because you're not just talking about the healthcare system.
We have the right major.
We have this massive decline in skilled workforce. What is it? Working population in general?
Yeah, 25 to 65 is 18% of in 2030 is what it would be in the year 2000.
So we have fewer people to work. We are also witnessing the emergence of tools like these LLMs, advances in AI technology, which depend heavily on massive data sets and can do amazing things with massive data sets, which incentivizes the collection of massive data sets, which incentivizes the theft of massive data sets.
Not only the theft, but just the numbers of doors and windows with which people can crawl into proliferates. And your security posture as a species in its digital sense is going to be getting bigger and hairier every single year. And we won't have the technical population to probably keep up with its maintenance.
It's too complex. Wow.
And so, right, in my meta-analysis, mine goes to doing, what about cyber, right? And so that's where I've landed, right?
Cybersecurity, you mean?
Yeah.
Wow.
So where I'm at now is a company called Red Canary that does managed detection response. Though I am not a hacker or anything involving that space, what I've done over the course of my career has been, touched every single corner of the data science stack. And this new role has sort of emerged that's really around the idea of being a data architect. So you need to understand how the visualization space works. You need to understand how machine learning algorithms work, how those data pipelines work, how to best architect multiple kind of underlying data systems, whether it be object store, data warehouse, data lakehouse, modern data architecture, these sorts of things. And it also involves the coordinating of a heck of a lot of humans to be able to, how do we get all these systems to talk to each other? How do we manage data ownership, data governance, and be able to have all inputs in an automated way, output really useful information, insight, and actions for an organization. So that's kind of where my role is at now. I think it's really cool because I get to solve really difficult problems that require deep domain expertise across 4 or 5 different areas of a tech stack, while also having to get to know and solve human problems along the way, constantly out of my depth. But for now, yeah, learned how to think as I get more white hairs on my head. But
wow, amazing! I see the trajectory. It makes sense.
Hindsight's 20/20, but yeah, it is.
Yeah, I don't mean I could predict it.
Yeah, if you can, you get paid a lot of money to predict things that complex. But yeah, that's where I'm at. And I think from a technical perspective, on a day-to-day basis, I touch Python, SQL, some NoSQL kind of languages, PySpark, really work my way up and down the AWS stack from object storage to warehouse to the thing I've been playing with most lately is how do we actually create a data mart, so to say, of, can I create repository where BI analysts will be able to just look up a data set, be able to see where that data set came from, how it's automated, who's in charge of each of the data elements, and really have the consumability and the data governance really baked into the way that you consume the product. And the modularity of the underlying data infrastructure is so much so that it is unnecessary for that BI analyst to need to become a data scientist to be able to just get decent output.
Because they can understand it at a high level and that's sufficient.
Yeah. So
because
like
of its modularity?
Yeah. So the tool that I've been leaning on for that at least within the AWS tech is called Data Zone. And so the idea is these folks, all they ever do is read blank table from Data Zone into a report. And that's all you need to know how to do that. That data is a product. It is not a data set. It is not a mess. It's cleaned, curated, approachable, explained, and governed.
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, the notion of data products it's kind of a topic in and of itself, right? But there are people that said, hey, let's create this monolithic data store where we just shove everything in there and then we can just find it. And then there are others that build really hyper specific data set. This solves this one single problem for this one single analyst. And the notion of a data product is that it offers enough flexibility and modularity to solve multiple problems, but it is so well curated, so well explained, and so well governed that one can search for the accounts receivable or, my accounting table to understand how churn, renewals, expansions, or certain product details all relate to one another. You can read that table and easily understand it as kind of a junior level analyst and take and run with it with a report. And that a lot of the difficult, I would say, skeletons in the closet or mathematic problems or really painfully defined metrics are already taken care of for you. That's really what Monocle sold was really a data product wrapped in a Python SDK as an API. And so I'm taking a lot of those concepts to be able to build this same story internally at Red Canary to be able to say, hey, like you have the ability to go to the store and pick out the data set that's best used for your use case. This sort of centralized repository is super modular underneath from an architectural perspective. So it can come from different places, but you get to consume something very simple.
Is that modularity related to ownership, like responsibility?
It is. And I think what's great is you can actually have some data governance controls around really specific features to where, let's say, management of sales territories. If you are doing an analysis, you read this data set in and you say, hey, these sales territories are funky. I can tell you that Bob, the head of sales, is responsible for the quality of that metric. Mm-hmm. So if the report is broken, it is not the analyst's fault. It's not the architect's fault. It's not the engineer's fault. It's Bob's fault, mm-hmm. And like we actually, upon establishing his ownership over that, data mechanism, Bob now is on the hook for the quality with which he outputs.
That's interesting. I may have told you something about what my dad is doing at a large defense contractor. And so it's actually related to several of the points that you've made today. His company has an aging workforce and is struggling to replace the talent that's leaving and is concerned about expertise being lost before it's imparted to the next generation. So my dad is designing a system to improve learning at his company. He calls it knowledge transfer. He says, essentially what we're doing is we're connecting people with questions to people with answers because almost 100% of the knowledge that we need to operate this company exists inside the company somewhere. But the problem is, if you need it, where do you find it? He's building the systems to make that easy. And one of the tasks is this system needs to take knowledge that is stored in the minds of employees and convert that into a database. That knowledge needs to be documented so that if that person leaves the company or if they die, their knowledge isn't lost. So he talks about knowledge capture. One of the difficulties is my dad anticipated, and it has been true, that people would say, this is just another task on top of my job. I already have too much to do. You're asking me to do one other thing, document my knowledge. And my dad is saying, no, the knowledge of your part of the organization is already your responsibility. Like you already have a responsibility to manage that. So he and I wrote a white paper together that has circulated around the company. And it basically says, if a manager is responsible for the cash used in their organization, they're also responsible for the knowledge used in their organization. And the problem is that we don't have a system for tracking the management of the knowledge in this part of the organization. And the reason for that is cash is homogenous. $1 is the same as any other. It's fungible. Knowledge is not. Like you can't exchange one fact for any other in a given task. So how do we create a system to manage this heterogeneous resource? Abstraction. That's the answer. So that's what my dad is doing. So he's developed what he calls knowledge networks,
Mhm.
not knowledge networks, knowledge hubs now, which are aligned with the organizational structure so that leadership at the top of the company knows who to hold accountable when metrics are not good. So
Mhm.
it seems like a similar problem to what you're
It
solving.
is similar. Well, and I think it's interesting because there's maybe four parts to it, right? Data quality makes sense. There's the knowledge transfer in a way that could be potentially codified with, kind of a generative AI sort of LLM perspective of like, can I create my internal Ask Jeeves within this organization? There we
Ask
go.
Jeeves.
Yeah. And then further is what we've discussed, which is like, how do I create responsibility for those data, the data being produced, and also codify the knowledge with which is around those data? He and I could probably have a great conversation
I
over a
bet you
beer or
would.
two. I think as a technologist, I'm so inclined to break things down by their source from a technical perspective. Like it came from this database or that database or this process or that process, and understanding exactly how to weave and build a consumption and presentation layer around the departmental and conceptual realities
Which is not
versus
always perfectly analogous to the source.
to the underlying source, right? Like, if you care about churn and then churn is recorded in your sales thing, but then, it's actually customer behavior and product behavior that are the largest drivers of understanding churn, then that means all of a sudden you have three different systems involved for something that is conceptually really
Okay.
only the interest of the customer success team and the executives in it from an executive perspective. And so it's like, and it gets kind of muddy if you think about the various parties. And so that's why, in my mind, a sort of least viable permissions kind of perspective of let's create this like it's a search bar. Search for the data you need, click on that data set. It'll tell you everything about it. And if you need more, we can open that aperture for your role to be able to bring in more data and or to do that on either just a data perspective or a reporting perspective. And you end up with this knowledge hub, but I do think it's really fascinating, the idea of this same data governance lineage to be coupled with really an internal Ask Jeeves kind of LLM aspect. Like to have that be your knowledge hub in every sense of the term is kind of a fascinating idea.
So what we're talking about right now is related to the messages I sent you earlier. So I wonder if it wouldn't be too jolting to bring that into the conversation now.
Yeah, yeah.
So a little bit of background. I find myself teaching Python, which is funny because I am an amateur at Python. Like I studied finance in school. It was odd that I did that in the first place because I'm really more of an artist. I started as architecture, studying architecture, and then switched to finance after the professors hurt my feelings. Went into investment banking, learned enough Python to apply some scikit-learn machine learning algorithms effectively for my team, which was relatively easy, but also caused them to think that I was a wizard and paid me big bonus and gave me an award. And then I left because I knew I wanted to leave and start my own company. And I found that there's some demand in finance for people to learn Python and use machine learning algorithms so that they could do basically the same thing that I did. So I started Machine Learning Edge. And for a while, I found myself as the CEO of this Python education company. Now I'm the head of instruction and Gil's the CEO. I'm still the guy responsible for telling people what Python is and how it works, which is a question that I'm still asking myself. And I want to do a great job. I want to know the answer to that question. I want to be right. And I want to be able to clearly convey that to PyFi students. And during this saga, I had some time where I wasn't working for PyFi and I got to learn a lot about a lot of different things. I guess it was as I started returning, I started writing the book, as far as I can tell, which is Philosophy and Religion. Realized it was going to take me longer than I expected, and I needed a source of income because the money that I had made from PyFi wasn't going to last me to the end of the project. So I thought I was going to start teaching finance stuff, Excel and financial modeling. But because I had spent time learning about philosophy and history, and I was writing this book and I wanted my work to somehow connect meaningfully to what I was doing in the book, I started asking some deep questions about financial modeling. Like, what is this? And a financial model is a representation of a company. So I started to ask, what is that? Like, what is a corporation? That's a deeper question than I expected. Studying it took me back to Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, which were written, I think, in the 1600s. And I discovered this beautifully organized first introduction, like a high level but relatively comprehensive survey of the body of English law. And I didn't read the whole thing, but Blackstone's approach and the thing that he produced made an impression on me. So that now, as I'm trying to understand Python as a whole and understand its parts and their relationships, I was inspired by what I perceived Blackstone to be doing and have been attempting to take a similar approach to the degree that I can in my analysis and presentation of Python, because the Python programming language is basically a body of law, even though I'm not sifting through case law, which makes my job a lot easier. I'm just reading the instructions that Guido and company wrote. So what I'm trying to do is organize all of the particular parts of Python reasonably, meaningfully, because things do naturally group together, and those groups naturally group together, so that if Python is one thing, then at the next level of analysis, there ought to be like 2 or 3 parts that represent major divisions of this thing. And in each one of those, there ought to be 2 or 3 parts that represent a major division. And Elon Musk says it this way. Somebody on Reddit asked him, how are you able to learn so much? And he said, I think most people are able to learn more than they think they can, and they just don't try. The trick is you need to understand the trunk and the major branches of a subject before you start learning about the leaves. Because if you do that, if you have this framework, you know where to put the leaves. And I've found that to be true as I've learned, which is the reason why I'm asking these questions. Like, okay, what is a corporation? What is Python? What is a programming language? I'm trying to establish the trunk and the major branches so that I can organize the leaves meaningfully, so that I can understand it myself, and so that I can present that to other people. And my hope is that by doing this, not only will the leaves be easier to understand because they'll have this meaningful context, but they'll also be easier to remember because they will be meaningfully connected to everything else. And also, I hope that the class will be more interesting.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to do.
I'm trying to figure out, that's what it's called. It reminds me very much so. Have you heard of the note-taking app Obsidian? So it's, imagine that every note you ever took, you drop these little like tags and nuggets into everything. And then there's also like a semantic layer that sits kind of on top of it from a linguistic perspective that breaks that down. There's this guy, he's the guy who developed Bible in a Year that has gotten famous from Father Mike Schmitz, but his name's Jeff Cavins. He has, I promise this is going somewhere relevant, but he has basically taken everything he's ever learned and read about the Bible ever, and he codifies it and tags it. And so you effectively have this like brilliant scaffolding of Jeff's mind.
Yeah, a classification.
You have this classification system, but you also have this like conceptual knowledge graph. Really, it has a knowledge graph functionality.
Because the patterns that underlie his knowledge are probably reflective of the patterns that underlie all knowledge in this subject.
And the meta-analysis itself reveals a derivative set of insights that, realizing that, something that Joseph, Jeremiah, Jesus, and Paul all said, all tie together in some interesting way, right? And so this sort of process it's been fascinating, because it was maybe 5-10 years ago when I first learned about this Cavins system, but I thought, oh, that's how I learn. Like, I need to read this whole book about computational linguistics so that I know where to, to have the skeleton, where I know where I need to hang that piece of meat.
Yeah. Which other people find ridiculous.
Yeah, they're like, why would you want to just like get the thing done? And I'm like, no, but I need to know how it fits together, because I might not need that thing. And I think it's how it makes sense that I've ended up in sort of this data architecture role as well. Is like, fundamentally a data architect is saying like, this is how this fits together, and I need to make sense of it.
Which requires you to understand underlying principles, which you never do if you just learn the trade.
I think that it's a beautiful gift that you need to invest in to be able to grow, but you just build up something so strong. I don't know. It's the way that I look at becoming, and not just resilient, but anti-fragile as well as an individual, right?
Because you're generally educated.
I don't know if you ever, it's not Cards Against Humanity, but some game like that. I won the card that of being the one who makes everyone the most nervous about like what he's going to do next, and my tolerance for risk being much higher, and all these sorts of things. Like, I won all of those cards, but I also won all of the cards that were like, if there's a zombie apocalypse, whose house are you going to? right? Not out of weapons, but out of an ability to get out of things and to figure things out. And it's because I've invested in that, versus, we see our parents' generation sometimes investing in, hey, I perceived safety as an individual to be, I have invested my entire life in working for this one company because it's super safe and provides stability.
Yeah.
I have spent my life as a cog, and that was unfortunate,
Well,
but
because I picked the right major,
yeah.
maybe. And maybe things aren't changing that rapidly. And so I can invest in my house on this plot of land because I don't expect to go anywhere, which is nice. Except we obviously are in times and entering into times of even greater chaos and change, which makes an understanding of the underlying principles more valuable, even more valuable, because it makes you more adaptable.
Our kids will not have, I think neither us nor we will have it halfway, let's say, but our kids will not have the luxury of stability that our grandparents had.
So it's 4:38 my time.
Yeah.
Is it 3:38 your time?
Yeah, and I know I don't want to. I got to keep the boss happy too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if the answer is no, it's totally fine. I don't mean to pressure you at all.
Yeah.
But could you squeeze any more time in now?
I could squeeze another 5 minutes in. Is
Another
that
5 minutes?
okay?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So maybe we can pick this up another time because I do want to talk about this
Yeah.
with you in more detail, but we won't be able to now, but I can give you a preview. So I'm trying to understand Python and its major divisions and its major subdivisions. And this is where I'm at. Python is the language-like interface of a logical operation processing machine. In other words, well, more simply stated, it's an interface. It has an implementation, what's happening under the hood to make it work, and it has an interface. So like you could break that into two parts, interface and implementation. The semantics of the language are a part of the interface. There's also language constructs, which are a part of the interface. The semantics are the functional purpose of the parts. The language constructs are notation, names, syntactic patterns, which are associated with those functional purposes. Users care about the semantics of the language. Users learn the language constructs because they have to in order to access the semantics. Users don't care about implementation. Users would rather not know about the implementation, except if those details are somehow relevant when I'm achieving this semantic purpose. I realized today, these things called language constructs, which is a name I'm not a big fan of, even though I don't have a good replacement. This is where heaven meets earth in programming language, because these symbols, like the left square bracket or the print function name, have character encodings, which ultimately are physically represented by voltage patterns. And those voltage patterns are a physical catalyst of physical mechanisms in a physical machine, which is your hardware. So things are happening physically when you send these characters to the Python interpreter. And these triggers, if I can call language constructs triggers, these triggers could be anything. You could just have a monkey type characters and associate that with the print function or associate that with a list initialization. But the Python developers didn't do that. They could have chosen anything. What did they do? They chose symbols which faithfully represent the semantics with which they are associated. They're meaningful representations. The meaning is the heaven. The voltage patterns are the earth. It's meaning and matter, or soul and body. It's the same, like it is the creation of Adam. Like it's the point where the fingers touch, which is Christ, which is the word, which is the language constructs. Like that's where it happens. Like at the point of the language construct, you have the superposition of meaningful representations and effective mechanisms. And we call it language constructs. That's the word. That's Christ. It's the point where the fingers touch.
Yeah. Well, there's kind of a metaphysical aspect to certain things as well, right? Like is what you're kind of getting to is, I think that human machine, programming became really easy to me when I realized that it's all about human machine communication and that a human helped create the Python language for other humans. It was like this gift, like, hey, this is really difficult. These are the underlying, ones and zeros and different kind of, electrons being fired, whatever that needs to happen. But I've turned it into a read data frame dot mean line for you. For you to get that average, right? And it's I think that I've since created a few and I don't know if you've done this, but I've created a handful of packages in Python that are on the pip library out there in the world. An AutoML one, as well as our last product. It's called Care Query, which is a pippable thing. And there is a unique feeling that you get when when you put that up there for the world to
Hmm.
have. To this, honestly, I always thought open source people, it didn't make sense to me. Like, what are you burning the midnight oil for? To just like give the community something? And I know that like gamer communities and they're used to that sort of thing, but I get it now. You know, it's like, hey, I did this thing for you guys and I'm proud of it and it's really useful for me. I'm going to explain it and like I would love for you to use it. And like, do you want to make it better? Like here, like fork it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, and to bring it to the theological, which is kind of interesting, is the Big Bang could, you know, in some scientific way represent the how of, you know,
Implementation.
how the first mover made his move, let's say, from a philosophical perspective. No one really, you know, it doesn't explain the why, right?
Right.
There is a way to philosophically work your way through there, but I won't bore your listeners to that metaphysical or to that philosophical prose. But we had a priest explain it to us really fun in a great way, in that kind of like existence itself, or God created the world in the same way that when you watch a really good movie, you cannot help yourself but try to help like share it with other people.
Oh, wow.
Right.
I love